I thought it was a little funny that the author is writing is talking about how, oh, Saul's like, tall and handsome and this stuff too. But then, when David's chosen to as well, it's like, oh yeah, he's like handsome and all this stuff too as well.
Well, I think it's interesting. I wonder, it does seem very clear that we get this description of Saul, we get this reinforcement in Eliab's introduction, then we get this counterpoint saying, hey, don't look for those things. And we get him coming back and saying, hey, these same things about David. I wonder if that might be intentional, to say, those are not signs to ignore people or to shut people off, right? Because we do that sometimes too. Like in Canada, we call it tall poppy syndrome, right? Like anyone who's too successful, we immediately ignore their perspective sometimes. Maybe the author's trying to counter that, but he's clearly trying to say, that's not the most important thing. You got to take the time to know who someone is. So don't write them off because they don't look like whatever you're looking for in any circumstance. Now, your second part is the writer putting his own perspective into it. Absolutely. And I think that's what I talked about at the start, is that we have to understand the Hebrew Scriptures are collecting different images, different conceptualizations of God all the way along. And it's in the wrestling and the grappling of those different conceptualizations together that we come to understand God. So when we take one verse or one story or even one book and we say, this is what God's like, that's not a faithful way to read the Bible, because we are meant to wrestle with this perspective of God and this together. And it's the same thing we do in community with each other. Anytime we go off on our own and we say, well, I've had an encounter with God, or I've heard God, therefore I understand who God is, but I don't listen to people in my life that I trust that say, actually, I see God this way, we're never going to get a fully rounded picture. So yes, writers are doing that, but those writers are held in relationship with other stories in the Scripture, and I think that's our work to do as interpreters. Thoughts on that?
I don't know if I have big thoughts on that. I think it's a great question, and I think it's this interesting tension we always live with the Scriptures. Like, what are they trying to say? What were they trying to say then? How does that offer us some wisdom now? I think with David, there are these moments almost where it's like, this is going to date me, this reference, where the channels change a little. You sort of feel like, is this the same person we're talking about? So again, I think they're always saying like this character is our way of seeing ourselves. This is about our identity. And I would say, like, let's listen for those moments where there's like a shift and it seems like, is this the same like little boy that walked in the room? Is this the same guy who's like running for his life or then killing other people? Like listen for those moments where, yeah, again, like the channel changes on David, and still there's a central question, which is like, what are they trying to say about who this group of people are in their relationship with their past, their present, and their future, I think.
So many times in history, we get a king who took over violently, and then they go ahead and backdate a mythology of how they were supposed to become king from the beginning, and this was the plan the whole time. How is this story different than that? How is it different from that? How do we engage with that?
Yeah, okay, so this is a really good question about a source criticism, essentially. So where do these sources come from? Generally, what we tend to think in scholarship is that these stories are being collected during the Babylonian exile, after the whole era of the kings. And so absolutely, these are hagiographies looking back at the most important characters in their history, highlighting how they came to power and what was good about them. What's beautiful about the Jewish story is they're not hagiographies in the classical sense. Like, they don't gloss over the incredible failings in David's life. They actually include that as part of the story. And I think we should pay attention to that. I think the Jewish people want us to pay attention to that, and I certainly think God does. But there is an element, probably of a sort of mythology of David, that is included in some of these tales. I think that's fair to say when we look back. One of the things that we think is happening in the Babylonian era, one of the things that we know is happening in the Babylonian era is that the history is being renegotiated, because we're going to see David's rise in 1st and 2nd Samuel, but then we have two books. There are two sets of two books, 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. In the Jewish Bible, those are just one book each, Kings and Chronicles. Kings and Chronicles cover all the period basically sort of after David through all the kings up to exile. One of those books tends to be very positive about all the kings. One of them tends to be quite negative about the kings. And it's interesting to see the Jewish people holding these two different versions of the same stories together and saying maybe there's something to learn in both of that we look back on our history with rose-colored glasses. And we say, what can we learn? What can we take from that? But at the same time, we don't jettison this more critical version of the story that helped us to see all the bumps along the way and all the failings of those kings at the same time. Maybe that's something we can even learn from for our own lives, is to look back on our lives and say, sometimes I need to look back with the best, most gracious rose-colored glasses on my life and say, yeah, I made a lot of mistakes, but I learned a lot and I grew a lot and I became a person that I'm proud of and want to be today. Other times I need to be very critical and say, hey, am I recapitulating errors and directions that I tried to move away from in my life? I think what the scriptures force us to do is hold all of that in tension. And I think that's what's beautiful about the Bible is you don't just get the cleaned up version of the story. You have to wrestle with both versions of it.
Oh, that's so good. I love the conversation you're opening, Curtis. It makes me think about what our stories sound like after trauma. Like, I think when we think about the exile, these stories are getting kind of pieced together, woven together, collected, really held as really precious. Once this is a group of people who've been taken from their land, had to, some of them find their way back. It's a terribly traumatic story. And I often go back to like what we can learn from hip hop culture. I find like the Old Testament and like hip hop culture really helpful actually, because there are these decades where before hip hop became such a central force in our culture, and you can argue about what that looks like right now, but there's so much cry of like, it's such a violent way of an art form. People really struggled with it. And I always like this perspective that this is like what it sounds like to sort of sing your liberation once you have been traumatized. So it's like, how do you have a sense of like, no, we survived, we were victorious, looking back on a story. So I always found that conversation really helpful. Like when we think about what are movements like that, what does it sound like to sort of sing our liberation after we've been traumatized? And you cannot understand it, but there's something to learn from it. So I think there's an opportunity to like sit with these texts and consider when they were really held close as precious and what that told them about who they really were in the world.